the cloud and share. Okay, so hello, welcome to the 74th LERA conference, and this is section 10.5? No, 11.5. I'm sorry. LERA best paper session, conflict and transition. We have two really great presenters. They don't even need the slides because they just so charismatic, and they can just give a wonderful talk. And then our first presenter is Eric Blanc from NYU, and I will just stop sharing and let Eric to introduce himself a little bit.
Can I actually go second? I'm having some technical difficulties, so if Daniel could go first, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. And then I guess the floor is yours. Can you start by introducing yourself, and then just go ahead?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Marschall. I'm a research professor at the George Washington Institute of Public Policy, and I'm also a senior advisor to an AFL-CIO organization called the Working for America Institute. I've had a very long-standing interest in dislocated workers, going back to my work in Ohio with dislocated worker programs in the 1980s, and have also been a big supporter of apprenticeship. So in the past couple of years, I've had a unique opportunity, and that's to study an apprenticeship program for dislocated workers in the manufacturing industry. This was very unusual. This is the first time that I know of that such a program was being conducted. So this is covered in a paper that's available, and I'm going to summarize the program, its methodology, and its findings. So this was a program of the Electrolux Home Products Incorporated plant in St. Cloud, Minnesota. That's kind of a medium-sized town about a few hours north of Minneapolis, and the plant manufactured freezers for many decades. So going back to early 2018, the company had 860 hourly workers. Now that was way down from say 2004, when the plant had 1,700 members of the collective bargaining unit, hourly workers there. This was a unionized plant by the International Association of Machinists, and it was the largest plant in the local of that particular union in the area. So for years, the workers and the union there had heard rumors about the possibility that the plant would close. The company denied that. And then in January 2018, the company did announce that it would be closing that St. Cloud plant and moving production to South Carolina. Now, Electrolux had a kind of a long-standing strategy of closing its plants in the north, closing its union plants, and going to the south, and to Mexico. So, we presume that decision was made at a higher level than St. Cloud. And the company said that they would close the plant in late 2019. So at that point, several union organizations, the Minnesota AFL-CIO, the State Labor Federation, the Machinist Union, a local workforce intermediary, and the company agreed to sponsor a manufacturing apprenticeship program for the workers there. And the company apparently hoped that by having an apprenticeship program there, it would help to keep workers at the plant during the period in which they wanted to continue producing freezers before this new plant in South Carolina was actually ready to open. The program, or the occupation that the program focused on, was called the Industrial Manufacturing Technician Program, the IMT. This is a program developed in Wisconsin primarily that teaches manufacturing workers certain basic skills that are widely applicable, been a pretty successful program, but this was the first time that they tried to operate such a program for dislocated workers. And again, so this provided an opportunity to study this situation. And the leaders of the company and the union agreed that the Working for America Institute myself could come in and do a case study. So the major aspect of this program was classroom education, with classes held twice a week in a training center that was right across from the plant. This was very important because it was convenient for the workers to go right over to the training program either before or after their shift at the plant. And then state dislocated workers funds were used to hire a very experienced instructor that I can talk a little more about. So methodology, my research involved 3 site visits to St. Cloud, where I was able to observe classroom sessions, conduct structured interviews with workers, union officials, company personnel, community college staff, as well as workforce intermediary staff. So I compiled and examined about 150 documents, and research and writing occurred over about 3.5 years. So this was a pretty long-term effort, and the pandemic had an effect, and I can talk about that. So important aspects of the program, one of the outcomes was it really emphasized the importance and the development of partnerships between the company, the union, the State Labor Federation in Minnesota, state government agencies, 2 community colleges, as well as local and national workforce intermediaries. And my full report has a chart which summarizes the roles of those various organizations. So what happened in the end? 35 former Electrolux workers participated in an apprenticeship graduation ceremony on September 30th, 2019. So the coronavirus pandemic hit Minnesota in March of 2020. So we're really interested in how that affected the workers, so that hit 6 months after the end of the program. And you would expect by that time, a good number of the workers would have found alternative employment. What we did find is that many decided to stay in community college. They were instructed by a community college professor, so they just stuck around there. So that was one interesting thing. But then 2 years after graduation, after the pandemic was kind of dying down, and the pandemic hit manufacturing very hard. So after 2 years, manufacturing was beginning to rebound, and 57% of the apprentices were employed at an average wage of $17.87 per hour, which is only about 2% lower than their previous Electrolux earnings. This in and of itself was a remarkable outcome. Previous dislocated worker studies showed that it generally took many years, a longer period, for dislocated manufacturing workers to get the sort of jobs that paid them comparable wages. In this case, it was done only after a few years. So out of the group, only 1 person was not employed or in college. 7 workers were in manufacturing. So again, the program demonstrated the importance of partnerships in a dislocated worker program, and also the capacity of a state labor federation to play an active leadership role in the development of that apprenticeship program. So that's it.
Yeah, 3 years in this system, I still forgot to unmute myself. And great. Like I like to learn more of the program that you studied then. But like before that, let's hear Eric's presentation first, and then we're gonna kind of like keep all the questions toward the end of the session.
Can we do a couple of questions first? I'm technical. I should be ready in 3 minutes, if that's okay. If we
Yeah,
if we do
absolutely.
thanks.
Yeah. Liz, do you want to jump in? Do you have questions? Because I have quite a few questions, but I don't want to dominate the conversation. No, yes, no. Okay, so Dan, I might miss this, but what kind of a skill they learned through this apprentices program? Like, you mentioned that they had classroom kind of classes, and what about the others? Like, where did they practice those skills?
So what the organization that developed this particular training program found that many manufacturers, many manufacturing workers went into their jobs with basically kind of a scattering of skills and knowledge about manufacturing. That enabled them to get a job in the manufacturing facility at a relatively low level. But because they didn't have the systematic knowledge, they were not able to move up.
Okay.
So one of the main purposes of this program was to kind of fill in that knowledge and allowing them to move up and gain skills in occupations that paid more. So it's a combination of knowledge about kind of the manufacturing universe, what's going on in manufacturing, how is technology automation affecting manufacturing jobs, as well as some practical skills. So what we found is not all of the workers at the plant had experience with computers. A plant like that would have some advanced, computer numerically controlled machining equipment, but they're kind of an elite, highly skilled group. So this program would enable them to get more accustomed to computers, to programming, and enable them to move up. So it's a combination of knowledge of manufacturing and particular skills that were a little more advanced than what they had been doing ordinarily.
So after the classroom training, they were able to use those skills and knowledge back to the factory they worked, like, in that period.
This is what was unusual. Generally, apprenticeship programs give people the kind of knowledge and skills that allow them to continue working in the same facility but move up. But in this apprenticeship programs, they were out the door. They were being dislocated. So it conceivably allowed them to get another job in manufacturing and be more prepared to move up. And I think I said that about 7 workers were in manufacturing. So the research has ended. I don't know what happened to them. That's the kind of theory that, but both in particular, the union really made the argument to its members that this is something that will help you in the future.
Cool. I have other questions, but it looks like Eric fixed his computer problem. Did you?
You're on
Because I
mute.
can see you. Yeah, you are.
Yes.
Mute.
I'm going to sign in from my computer. If you give me 1 second, I'll be connected. I'm so sorry. Wait 1 second.
No. Take your time. Like, so I can ask the next question. And you mentioned that, like, because of the pandemic, that's 6 months after the completion of the program, but the majority of the folks actually stayed in college. So, like, I found that particularly interesting, right? Like, do you think that's because they get the exposure of the college education through this program, so they're likely to stay and pursue a different career path, or this became some kind of, like, I don't know, safety buffer because of the pandemic?
Yeah, this is a question that I asked several people.
Mhm.
And what the union folks said was that because, so the training itself happened in these classroom sessions in a training center.
Mhm.
Training was by a community college instructor, but because some of the individuals did not have access to computer at home or were
Mhm.
not accustomed to using computers, they could go to the community college
I
and
see.
use computers there. And there were
Mhm.
staff at the community college who could help them.
Mhm.
So the union folks felt that this experience of interacting with a community college made their folks, the workers, more kind of adjusted and comfortable being in a community college environment. So they
Mhm.
decided this is speculation. They decided, well, rather than getting out in the workforce, it's the
Mhm.
pandemic. I don't want to
Mhm.
get sick. I don't know how
Mhm.
many we see manufacturing jobs
Yeah.
disappear at that moment. I'm going to
Mhm.
stay around and take additional classes. And some people took classes to enable them to get into other occupations. I think there's one person who became an RN. Um,
Oh, that's great.
for
Yes,
example,
that's actually kind of like my thoughts. Like maybe they got exposure with different kind of courses, and then they can pivot to different career paths. So the
right,
guy that went to became an RN, that's like really amazing.
right.
Okay, I'm gonna hold my question like if later, but now we're gonna pass the floor to Eric.
Thanks. And
And
could you make me co-host? I do have slides. I
you
got
can
them.
just share, like you don't need the co-host to share.
Okay,
Yeah, I think
perfect. I'm
that
going to
they
share
they
my
changed the
screen
setting.
then. Okay, and
Mhm.
apologies for the technical difficulties, everybody.
By the way,
Thank you for joining
congratulations on
us,
your new
Eric. I hope
job.
you're feeling better.
Yeah, I'm feeling. Oh, thank on the job. Oh, yes, very exciting.
Yeah.
I'm starting at Rutgers shortly at the
I followed
laser
you on
department.
Twitter, so like
You found me on
I saw your
Twitter.
picture with Chris in front of the warehouse. So,
Oh yeah, it's exciting times
oh yeah,
labor wise.
absolutely.
Okay, I'm gonna
Yeah, you might want to kind of reskill the.
yeah, this should be right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody. Well, thank you for having me. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Tingting. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm going to dive straight in. The topic that I'll be presenting on is labor in a digital era, leveraging computational text analysis for labor studies. And the specific question that I examine is, how can we use digital data to explain why West Virginia strikers in 2018 in the big statewide teachers strike that I assume most of you have heard about, how does this data help us evaluate strikers' evaluation of victory? Why strikers in West Virginia believe they won or they lost? And the big research agenda that this interacts with is trying to fill in a gap in the labor studies research. What I'll show is that the data footprint left by digitally enabled actions enables us to open new research agendas. Until recently, for example, we didn't have the data or the tools to rigorously measure the evolution of workers' views during mobilizations. And unfortunately, labor scholars, unlike other disciplines, for the most part, haven't yet begun to leverage computational text analysis. To my knowledge, my research is maybe the first or among the first to do so. What I'll focus on here, as I alluded to, is specifically why participants' subjective sense, what was participants' subjective sense of victory, if and why they believed that they won or lost a struggle. This is a question that has crucial consequences. Feelings of victory tend to give workers a sense of power and encourage them to continue fighting for more. Defeats, in contrast, tend to be discouraging and demobilizing. So if we want to understand how and why labor movements grow or recede, we need to be able to test and explain workers' perceptions of victory. This is an inherently subjective dynamic that up until recently was extremely difficult to measure. As such, most accounts punt on the question of participants' views, and instead they completely either ignore the outcomes of actions, as is the case with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, for example, or they only measure victory through policy gains. But as the course of the West Virginia strike clearly demonstrates, participants' perceptions of victory don't always correspond to the concessions won. So it's helpful just to start with basic timeline of the strike for those of you who aren't familiar. In 2018, after months of buildup, educators in all 55 counties of West Virginia began a strike on February 22nd. 5 days into the strike, on February 27th, West Virginia's governor and union leaders jointly declared that the strike is over. They announced that they had reached a deal to pass a 5% pay raise and to establish a task force on how to better fund West Virginia's public health insurance called PEIA. The New York Times, like the rest of the press that evening, reported that the unions had won and that the strike was over. But most educators immediately rejected the deal and chose instead to go on a wildcat strike. So here's a short video, hopefully the audio, you can hear it, from the scene on the Capitol steps the evening of February 27th. Let's see if it works. So what you can see there is workers surrounding union leaders. After the union leaders said the strike was over, thousands of strikers are yelling at them, chanting "back to the table and fix it now," which is a reference to PEIA, the health insurance. Following this unexpected outcry from below, the strike ended up continuing another week, concluding on March 6th. The puzzle my research tackles is the following. After going wildcat to reject the deal, why did educators enthusiastically declare victory on March 6th when virtually the identical deal was passed? Policy gains can't explain this shift, since by all accounts, the concessions won on the main demands of the strike were the same. And I want to underscore that this really was an actual puzzle. There were a lot of different competing explanations put forward by educators and others to explain what had just happened. Later in the talk, we'll look in detail at each of the main explanations, but it's helpful to briefly just flag them here. The first was that strikers were actually opposed to the deal both times. The second explanation was that strikers didn't initially declare victory because the deal wasn't signed yet. And the third explanation was that the strikers shifted their evaluative focus and expectations over the course of the strike. To test these competing hypotheses, we need reliable data on strikers' evolving views, and we also need a method to measure these. Fortunately, we have both. As you can see in this graph, roughly 90% of educators were members of the viral Facebook group, West Virginia Public Employees United, that served as the communications hub for the strike and really helped initiate that independently of and autonomously from the union. It's worth noting that this was a closed Facebook group. You had to request to join, which allowed the admins of the Facebook group to vet people like out-of-state trolls or spammers. And by all accounts, this Facebook group was the main way educators communicated with other educators outside of their own schools. And so while of course Facebook can't capture the sentiments of that minority of educators who are disengaged from the strike, as well as the Facebook group, for the purpose of my research, that's irrelevant because we're looking to explain why mobilized educators shifted from feelings of defeat to victory, both online and offline. It's also worth keeping in mind that the West Virginia Facebook group was unmoderated. Unlike some of the other Facebook groups in the 2018 teachers strike wave, like Arizona and Oklahoma, these admins didn't really try to determine the content of the group. Anybody could post, and it was a very freewheeling space for debate and deliberation. And the fact that the group was so consistently contentious should also give us confidence that no educator views were significantly underrepresented in it. The sheer volume of educator participation is also impressive. There were about 500,000 total posts and about 2.5 million total engagements. And this was especially true in the two assessment periods when the Facebook group was overwhelmingly focused on debating the deal. That's first on February 27th, 28th, remember that's when they go wildcat, and then March 6th when they declare victory. And so for all of these reasons, we can be fairly confident that the views expressed in the Facebook group basically reflect the viewpoint of trends of strikers as a whole. But obviously just having data isn't enough. We need a measurement method as well. And that takes us to topic modeling, which is an automated, unsupervised machine learning method that uncovers documents' latent topics via word cluster patterns. Here's a very simplified diagram of the workflow. Basically, you collect text documents, then via a lot of data wrangling and coding in R, the produced topic model identifies recurring clusters of words. We can then quantitatively measure the relative importance of different subjects in a given document and over time. And I'd be happy to talk more in the Q&A about the mechanics of all this. But if any of you are interested in the sort of details, I used LDA as my statistical method for the research. the final model had 121 topics, 0.2 alpha on the entirety of the post in the 2 assessment periods. And to allow for replicability, I used a seed number 1. To give you a simple explanation of what this looks like, we follow the following word group over the course of the strike: pay, raise, salary, state. We can obviously code this as raise and then measure educators' focus on this over time. And as you can see, it went up pretty dramatically towards the end. But for our research question, we need to know not only what subject strikers were most focused on, but also how they felt about these subjects. And that's where sentiment analysis comes in. Sentiment analysis scores emotions in documents in reference to a dictionary of keywords. It's mostly used to measure positivity and negativity, and that's how I use it as well. For those who are interested, I use Bing Glue's opinion lexicon for my sentiment analysis. And per best practices, I counted for negation and customized the dictionary slightly to reflect the studied domain. Put simply then, to solve the puzzle of West Virginia strike, I first used topic modeling to measure strikers' greater or lesser focus on distinct evaluation subjects on February 27th and March 6th. Then I used sentiment analysis to measure the shift in strikers' feelings about these subjects and the overall strike outcome. The results allow me to then test the 3 main competing explanations for the puzzle. And then after testing these 3 competing explanations, I turned to the qualitative data to clarify causal mechanisms underlying the measured shifts. Okay, so now I'm going to go into the 3 separate explanations. The first hypothesis, which I call the repeated rejection, essentially denies that there was a puzzle. According to this explanation, strikers were opposed to the deal both times, and the union just rammed it through. Here's one article making this case. I did find evidence for this hypothesis in both interviews and on the Facebook group. For instance, here, 2 strikers post on March 6th. You can see one person, for instance, saying PEIA is not fixed people. But the question arises, were these types of views the exception or were they the rule? And on this, the sentiment analysis is unambiguous. When we take a sentiment score, there's clearly a negative evaluation on February 27th and a positive evaluation a week later. And the same shift in sentiment is present when we do a sentiment analysis just on the posts that explicitly mention the keyword deal. You can see the baseline starts more negatively, but the shift is about the same. The ethnographic evidence further corroborates this trend. While on February 27th, strikers shouted down union leaders in response to the deal, here's their response on March 6th. They're chanting back to school in an enthusiastic manner. So in short, the evidence clearly falsifies the first explanation. On to hypothesis 2. This I call the union hypothesis because it was the official explanation given by union leaderships. According to them, strikers didn't initially declare victory because the deal wasn't signed yet. According to this interpretation, as seen, for example, in this March 6th article by the National Education Association, the reason that educators weren't happy on February 27th wasn't that they rejected the deal, rather it's that they supported the deal and that they were upset that it hadn't yet been signed into law by the Republican State Senate. There is considerable amount of evidence to suggest the plausibility of this account. Let's look at what the topic model results can tell us. We find that 4 issues pertaining to the strike outcome remained the overwhelming evaluative focus of strikers in both assessment periods. The first topic was concerned the deal signing. The second concerned raise. The third concerned PIA. And the fourth was related to issues of collective pride with top words like proud, strong, made change history. But again, we need to ask, what was the relative focus of educators on each of these subjects? What do the data tell us? Well, we find that topics concerning the deal signing made up only 13% of total evaluations, which was the lowest percent of any of the major topics. And remember, we're not just interested in the focus of strikers, but also in how much their sentiments shifted over time. And what this graph shows us then is the shift in sentiment from February 27th to March 6th. What we see is that the deal signing subject here is even lower in relation to the other topics. And there's further evidence undermining the union hypothesis. Namely, it can't explain some key issues concerning the strike's timeline. Let's remember that on the evening of February 27th, thousands of educators chanted down their union leaders. Crucially, this took place hours before it became known that the deal hadn't been signed by the Republican State Senate. Accordingly, the strikers were chanting, "Fix it now" and "back to the table," not chanting anything having to do with the deal signing. Of course, it's possible that the strikers on the steps weren't representative of educators as a whole, so it's important to triangulate our qualitative evidence with more representative quantitative data. Here's a graph tracking strikers' anger at Republican State Senate head Mitch Carmichael by looking at the number of angry face emojis directed at him on Facebook. It might be a little silly to track angry face Facebook emojis, but strikers actually did use them to express their anger, so it's a good measure. You can see that anger against Carmichael peaks not on February 27th, 28th, as we would expect according to the union hypothesis, but rather only on March 1st and 2nd, only after the strikers had already gone wildcat. So for all of these reasons, we can safely conclude that while concern about the deal signing was a contributing factor to the strikers' shift, it was consistently less of an important factor than PEIA, collective pride, and the raise. As such, the evidence falsifies the union hypothesis, which argued that the absence of a signature on the deal was the main or the only reason why strikers did not initially declare victory and why they therefore decided to continue to strike. The final explanation, which I'll call the criteria change hypothesis, was that strikers shifted their evaluative focus and expectations. This take was put forward by a minority of strikers over a Facebook group as well as in interviews. To test this hypothesis, we first need to see whether there were in fact major evaluation shifts in focus and sentiment between February 27th and March 6th. We need to identify if there were any core issues that were driving both this shift in focus and in sentiment. And finally, we need to take a look at the qualitative data to see if there are plausible causal mechanisms that can account for these shifts. As it turns out, there were major shifts. This is a graph of strikers' evaluative focus over time. What you see is a dramatic drop in focus on PEIA by March 6th, and a similarly dramatic increase in focus on the outcome of collective pride. And when we look at the sentiment score shifts, we see the same pattern. By far, the largest positive shifts in sentiment are associated with collective pride and PEIA, and only much smaller shifts for the other issues. The fact that the same two subjects, collective pride and PEIA, were driving both the shifts in sentiment and the shift in evaluation focus indicates that these were in fact the two issues most consequential for shifting strikers' views. The qualitative data give us a good sense of the nature of the shift on PEIA. What we see in the comments on March 6th is not just that PEIA is talked about less, but it's talked about more positively. Winning a permanent funding solution for PEIA is now seen as more of a long-term goal rather than something they expected the strike to immediately win. In other words, they lowered their expectations for the strike. And this trend is confirmed by the quantitative data, which register a significant increase in the use of future tense words in posts that mention PEIA. So you can see that graph. Future tense words goes up on March 6th. For qualitative evidence on this shift, here's a clip from March 6th illustrating what collective pride looked like on the day of victory. We're chanting, "We made history, who made history, we made history." The Facebook posts, which I'll skip over for time reasons, illustrate a similar strong sense of pride in their movement. And what's interesting is the pride isn't specifically related to the policy gains ones, which aren't even mentioned. As this educator put it, "I have a newfound fire in my heart. I feel refreshed, proud, confident." And it's not tied to particular demand, at least not here. The available evidence, in short, does support the explanation that strikers shifted their focus and sentiments on major evaluation subjects, above all PEIA and collective pride. At the same time, the evidence contradicts the repeated rejection hypothesis, which denied that strikers increased their positive sentiments towards the outcome. It also contradicts the union hypothesis, which denied that strikers changed their focus. But to feel fully confident in the criteria change explanation, we need to be able to identify a causal mechanism driving this shift. And here the qualitative data are most useful. The mechanism that emerges from the data is that after going wildcat against the deal, strikers shifted their views in response to the obstinance of Republican state senators led by Mitch Carmichael. To get a sense of the new dynamic that emerged after the strike went wildcat, here's a clip of what soon became one of the strike's major chants, "Move Mitch, get out the way."
Move Mitch, get out the way, get out the way, get out the way. Move Mitch, get out the way,
period also witnessed an explosion of anti-Mitch memes, of which I'll just give you only a taste. We're going a little quick on time. Simpsons. This is a West Virginia food reference, if you know anything about pepperoni rolls, and Pitt is the rival football team. And in short, the deal became a proxy for pride and power. On February 27th, most strikers saw the deal as a capitulation to the governor. But by March 6th, the deal came to symbolize a victory over Carmichael and the Republican Senate. Here's a striker's comment on March 5th. We are standing for something more than a raise. We are standing on the integrity of our profession. Because of all this, overcoming Carmichael's opposition eventually allowed strikers to call a win on the deal on March 6th. Republican obstinance thus played a significant role in shifting educators' focus, but this shift took place only after educators had already started their wildcat strike. Contrary to the union hypothesis, the deal's initial lack of a signature doesn't explain why strikers on February 27th decided to continue striking. But Republican obstinance does help explain why educators shifted their views and their expectations after initially rejecting the deal. As one celebrating striker put it on March 6th, glad Mitch got out the way. So I'm going to stop here. I have final big picture thoughts, but maybe we can talk about future use of computational text analysis in labor studies, but I've gone on for quite a bit of time, and so I'm going to stop sharing. And
well,
I look
this
forward
is
to
a cozy group, right? Like, you know, we can probably like talk as much as we want, but I do find like your study is super interesting. But I have a question that I'm gonna, you know, forgive my kind of ignorance in terms of this whole experience. When we talk about teachers went on strike, right? Like, you know, there's a one kind of like, you know, dynamic aspect, or like a kind of like, you know, a temporary aspect we need to focus on. The longer the teacher went on strike, the longer the kids don't go to school, right? So when you evaluate your result and evaluate like the outcome of your kind of collective agreement, that will factor in over time, right? Like, you know, a lot of teachers are gonna start thinking, oh, like I can go on strike for a week, that's fine. But for 2 weeks, I need to start thinking about the kids. And now, like, if I go on strike for 3 weeks, the parents gonna start like, you know, being really bitter about like this whole action. So I need to start factoring in the public perceptions. So my question is like, you know, in your topic and modeling, did you find those factors that do not really corresponding to the content of the contract or the focus of the labor action that being taken into consideration in terms of how teachers evaluate the outcome?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, it does show up. As I mentioned, for the purpose of this presentation and the slide, I just focused on the top topics. So these were the top four. The question of like community support, if I recall, it was like number 6. So it was actually quite high up there. It didn't factor in quite as high, but it was certainly a major reason for the perception of victory, which was to say that parents supported at the end as well. The reason it doesn't factor into this specific research question as much is that the parent support remained relatively high both times. So it doesn't help explain the shift so much, because it was high in the first, when they went wildcat, and it was high towards the end. So they talk about it quite a bit, but it doesn't, the perceptions of what the community was willing to accept didn't per se factor in to the decision to continue this strike. Because if anything, you know, intuitively it might make sense to end a strike, like a teacher strike early, in order to not hurt parents. So there was not, but since they decided overwhelmingly to continue the strike, you could understand maybe why that wasn't a major concern, or if it was a concern, it was not something that they were willing to express.
And kind of like, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. So Eric, I'm wondering about the kind of organizational and union dimension of this. Was the behavior and the attitudes of the workers affected by what sort of union they had? Was this the National Education Association? Was this the AFT? Was this an independent union? number one. And then related to that, the fact that they were willing to go on a wildcat strike makes me wonder, this is West Virginia, which has had a very strong United Mine Workers, and there were a lot of wildcat strikes. And probably, I wonder whether some of the teachers felt more comfortable in that way because of that history and probably connections in their family to coal miners.
Yeah, so both of those are really good questions. In response to which unions, there's actually 3 unions in education in West Virginia. There was an NEA affiliate, there was an AFT affiliate, which were about equal in size, and there was a somewhat smaller independent service workers union, which is largely bus drivers and custodians union as well. And part of the reason for the emergence of this Facebook group actually was it was a mechanism through which rank and file and sort of mid-level union leaders could overcome some of the divisions between the unions. There was a perception that unions were doing their own thing ineffectually, and there had to be unity across unions. And so this Facebook group was a mechanism to bring everybody together. And so that spirit certainly played into the wildcat. And what you said is entirely right. Certainly, there was a lot of educators when I would interview them said, my daddy was a coal miner and I was on the picket line with him, and so I come from a 3rd, 4th generation union family. And so I do think that helps explain some of the militancy in West Virginia, and also some of the reason why the strike wave began in West Virginia. And in fact, the prehistory to the part I talked about in this presentation, which is like the buildup to the strike, was also initiated to a significant extent by some of the southern counties, some of the traditional coal counties like Mingo. And there was actually one-day wildcat walkouts in Mingo County and Mercer and a few other southern parts of the state that helped inspire the rest of the state to eventually do their own statewide walkouts. So yeah, your intuition there is correct.
Yeah, I think Mingo County was always a strong center of the UMWA, but your research also shows a kind of positive example of the power of social media to unify people across organizational lines, which is very interesting.
Right.
I want to kind of like piggyback on that. Like you really asked about the methodology, right? Like you are using computational social science, like a topic modeling and sentiment analysis. One of the challenge I see is that folks have strong opinion will speak out in those community platform, right? So the representation issue, like are we picking a general sentiment, or are we picking just those loud voice? How do we reconcile those things? And also on top of that, like you mentioned that you have 121 topics. That was a little bit too many. Like I haven't read any kind of papers in social science that have such a large number of topics, right? So is this kind of did you derive this based on they have some kind of evaluation to give you the optimal topics, right? And did you derive that based on that, or is there any way that you can aggregate the numbers? Because I don't think any paper can really take into consideration of 121 topics.
Sure. So topics in this sense is actually more of a statistical rather than analytical thing. But so the topic here includes something like there's not 121 separate analytical topics related to the strike. A lot of these words are things like types of grammatical functions. So for instance, you would have a topic that would be words related to forward motion or something. So it's not that you have 121 different things that strikers are debating. Of the actual substance, and some of them are just adjectives. So like a lot of words related to happy, for instance. So the mechanism that I used for how you get to the number of topics you choose, because that is part of the, there's an aspect to which the researcher has to determine that.
Because you use LDA, you have to determine,
right? So with
predetermine the number of topics, right?
Yeah, so it's an iterative method.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So you basically, my criteria for this was based off of best practices, which was that you're trying to look for you basically keep on going until you find a number that has both the highest number of legible topics, the fewest number of topics that are just sort of like gobbledygook random, but that also has a sufficient number of discrete topics that you can answer your research question. And so essentially I just, I think as a methodological question for this, the proof is sort of in the pudding, which is that you, insofar as I can, in the paper, which for instance I will publish on this, I can publish the whole entire 121 topics, and then you can see that the sort of results are both legible and I'm not like omitting any topics. And so it is true. There's a bit of a room for discretion for the researcher, which I think the part of the reason then why I mentioned like the specific alpha and things like this that I use is so that people can replicate it. Because then the test to make sure that a researcher isn't like sort of cooking the books on this is that you provide the data and then they can run it too. And if somebody gets completely different results, then you have reasons to question the findings. But based on my research on this, there's no, all of the different iterations are actually very similar. You get very similar results. You just get slightly more precision. That was my experience with this.
Awesome, thank you. And I also have a question for Dan. The educational program, like, did the worker get paid when they go to the classes? They participate in the apprentices program?
So when the workers were in the apprenticeship program, going to classes twice a week, they were still working full time at the plant. And the program organized the classes around the time that they were going to work. So the folks who went to work in the afternoon would go to their class beforehand, and then the other way around. So they still had money coming in, and the training they received was free basically, because it was being paid by government funds. So all they had to do really was to put their effort and determination into picking up the material, which was, a challenge, but they had money coming in.
Yeah, but I don't know, like maybe I'm just kind of like too materialistic thinking, right? Like, if I have this job and I need to work full times, and there's no guarantee that I will have another job once I finish this program, even though I don't really pay anything, but like what motivates me to really kind of spend my time and then join the program?
This was a big challenge. How do you convince the workers that this is really going to benefit them? And the union worked hard at that, but some of the workers said, well, we don't really know what's going to happen after the plant shuts down and we're unemployed. Some thought, oh, we won't have any trouble getting a new job. So it was a matter of union and the advocates for the program trying to convince them that this would benefit them. This is also where the State Labor Federation came in. There was one top staff person there, and I was able to observe this particular meeting. He worked in a manufacturing plant. He said he picked up all kinds of skills there, but his skill acquisition was never documented. And he saw that was detrimental to his ability to get a job in that area. So he tried to motivate the workers in that way, but it's literally trying to get into their heads and get them in the right stage of mind. And for dislocated workers in particular, they're kind of all over the place and they're under a great deal of stress. They don't know what's going to happen to them.
Yeah.
The pandemic comes along at exactly the moment where they should be reemployed. So it was kind of all over the place in that way.
Can I ask a question after? No, I'll go after you. You have a follow-up.
So 2 questions. First, did those workers get some kind of certificate or any credentialing after finishes the program? Second, like, is there any kind of like overall cost benefit analysis in terms of like how much investment we need to kind of put into to run a kind of sustainable program like this?
Yeah, so for the first one, this is a major benefit of apprenticeship that at the end, they receive a apprenticeship completement form that
Okay.
is essentially good all over the country because it's supplied by the federal government. So that was a major selling point. What was the second
Yes.
question?
Like the overall cost benefit analysis.
There has been a little research on that done in construction.
Mhm.
And they find that no, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to remember exactly the finding. Generally, they find that individuals who have gone through an apprenticeship program have about 1.5 higher wages in future jobs. It's been very difficult to get these kind of cost benefit analysis for
Mhm.
apprenticeships. My study was unusual in that I had access to the workers, the union, and the employer. Oftentimes, that in and of itself is difficult to get. So that is a major area for future research.
That's excellent. Thank you. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, thanks. I was really interested in the program. My question was, do you have a sense of how many initiatives like this are happening elsewhere? Like how rare and how common would you say this is? And is there any, are there any trends of people trying to replicate similar initiatives?
Yeah, this was one of the things that really interested me about doing this research. This is the first time that I am aware of where an apprenticeship program has been used with persons who knew they were going to be dislocated, because that's very unusual. So, and I still haven't come across any of them. So right now, much of the focus on building apprenticeship in the United States is trying to figure out how it relates to occupations in healthcare and technology. We know that it works in construction in particular, in manufacturing, but there's this whole new area of how do we adjust and improve apprenticeship so that it's relevant to workers in healthcare, the people who are becoming computer programmers. And honestly, that is the most exciting area. And that was conveyed in several sessions, I think, at the LERA conference.
Yeah, great. Excellent.
Does that make sense, Eric?
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting.
I have another question for Eric, because this is something that I'm a little bit puzzled. Maybe like because I'm not familiar with the kind of like the labor relations structures in West Virginia. Like, wouldn't the membership need to ratify the collective agreement? How did the white strike like happen?
Yeah.
Like, why did the members, like the leadership, just kind of like announce something without the ratification vote? Like, it just didn't make sense for me.
Yeah, well, there's no formal collective bargaining in West Virginia. That's the short version. There's no there's no institutionalized collective bargaining. Bargaining, insofar as it happens, is sort of informal. It's usually lobbying the state for money, and then so that the level of informality created the space in which the union leadership could sort of arbitrarily say a deal's been made, and there was no formal vote. And it also meant that at the end, everyone could just declare sort of by acclamation that they liked the second deal. And in
But they
part,
get the exact same deal, right? So it means that it was a good deal.
Yeah, well, so that was the puzzle. I mean, that's what I sort of tried to get at in the papers. It was a genuine puzzle. It's like, they literally declared victory a week later. And I think the short version is really they lowered their expectations, that the deal seemed bad when they thought they were going to win a lot more. And then sort of a variety of events pushed them to lower their expectations, but then they still were able to overcome. If it had just been accepting the same deal, period, on the terms of the government, I think that people would have felt deflated. But because some of the Republicans eventually blocked the same deal by defeating, by then winning the deal that was initially promised. Workers were able to feel like they had won, right? Which is important for a sense of victory. So it was, even though the material concessions were the same, the fact that they had to win it sort of a second time created a different dynamic as far as perceptions of power.
Oh,
So do you think
interesting.
that the workers got a sense of empowerment in what they did? And I think when you said there's no collective bargaining, that applies to public employees, right?
Yes, there's no collective bargaining for in the public sector.
Right.
Yeah, there's still private sector.
Kind of felt disempowered over the years, but this experience gave them a sense of their collective power. And that was something that they identified with, a very positive kind of sentiment.
Right.
Oh,
exactly.
maybe because they almost lose this thing, suddenly getting it back become very, very, I don't know, valuable or satisfactory, I guess. I think it's a really interesting kind of study, like, interesting question to understand like the rank and file and how do they perceive different bargaining dynamic or in a sense like collective action dynamic. So I look forward to reading this. Like I don't know how you're gonna put those videos in your paper, but I think it will be super fun to at least see those like memes being included in the
And
academic
I was
paper.
thinking about I was thinking about that for the paper itself. You lose a little bit without some of the visual data. So
Absolutely, and a
know
lot
exactly.
of I think a lot of sentiment over there.
Yeah, exactly. I got to figure out how to incorporate it. Maybe they'll let me print some of the memes.
Mhm.
One other thought on my part. We have seen in the past year or two this big upsurge of support among workers for organizing at places like Amazon and Starbucks and others, a big upsurge. But this happened with the teachers back in 2018. And I recall there was this period where there seemed to be explosions of upsurge among teachers. So I wonder if that was in some way, they were kind of the leading edge or the vanguard of this kind of collective action.
I think so. I think that's true. The causal, relations between the stuff is hard to parse out, but the difficulty was the pandemic put all of that on hold for educators, whereas for other workers, it's sort of activated in some ways, and for educators on the whole, put them on the defensive. And only now are we starting to see strikes again now as we're sort of transitioning to a different period.
Okay, I think we are up for the time. I apologize, Liz, we didn't really give you a chance to speak it out. And do you have something that like, final words, final sentence?
Not sure Liz was actually on.
Okay, so for Eric and Dan, do you have some final thoughts before we wrap up?
I would just reinforce what you said earlier, that this has been a really dynamic LERA session, and we look forward to more in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Daniel. I learned a lot, and I appreciate you helping organize.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us, Eric.
Thank you. I actually really enjoyed this cozy conversation.
Yes.
We are running a podcast here. Thank you, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. And wish you get better, Eric.
Yeah, thank you. I'm feeling a little bit better today. Thanks.
Okay, awesome.
Bye.
Go
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care. Bye, folks.
Bye-bye.